Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York, MAC. Today is Tuesday, September 9th, 2025, and welcome to the formal lecture part of this week's lecture and office hour. As I hope everyone now knows, Uh, this is the third week and third module for our fall 2025 semester. And this week, we begin a two-part discussion on how global trade is managed among nations. We will conclude the two-part discussion next week, obviously, because it's two-part, with a review of the institutions that have been set up since World War II to manage global trade, as well as the history of these institutions and their different roles. So let us now address the learning objectives for this week's module by interrogating the following questions. Question 1. Differentiate between different eras in the theory of trade and their underlying themes. It is important to note that the economic outcomes of theories of trade across the eras that we will now cover inform the international political economy's evolution in favor of a liberal order, despite current tensions in the rules-based international system. Indeed, today's lecture will offer informative theoretical and historical foundation for many of today's arguments on the Trump administration's international trade tariff. The first is the mercantilist period. The origins of international political economy are closely associated with the development of modern European states and their global markets. The modern European state gained official recognition at the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which marked the defeat of the Catholic Habsburg countries by mostly Protestant countries in Northern Europe. The Treaty of Westphalia upheld state sovereignty and territorial integrity by institutionalizing changes to prevent external religious and secular authorities, i.e., the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and other states from interfering in a state's internal affairs. A major factor enabling the state to establish its authority vis-a-vis international, internal and external forces was the development of mercantilism. Now, here's the interesting part, and some of this may seem eerily similar to the arguments that we now have in 2025. For instance, mercantilists were acutely aware of the linkage between politics and economics, viewing both power and wealth as essential goals of national policy. The mercantilist states could use their wealth to build up their armies, hire mercenaries, and influence their enemies and allies. Thus, they accumulated gold and silver by seeking trade advantages over others in the following ways. First, they increased their exports and decreased their imports of manufactured goods. Sounds very familiar to current argument about tariff and industrialization. Again, as I mentioned during the first week of class, I will be intentional about drawing a direct line between the theories and histories that we cover in the class and the realities of our today's international economy environment. Secondly, mercantilists restricted raw material and technology exports to prevent others from developing manufacturing capabilities. And third, mercantilists Mercantile states imported raw materials they needed to reduce cost for their own manufacturers. Colonialism was central to mercantilism because the colonies provided the metropole, that is the colonizing power, with raw materials and served as markets for its manufacturers. As such, manufacturing in the colonies was usually prohibited. The Industrial Revolution and British hegemony is the second era. Mercantilism, as the term is used in the class textbook, is a pre-industrial doctrine. The Industrial Revolution, which began in about 1780, affected only some manufacturers and means of production, and initially progressed from region to region rather than involving entire countries. However, Britain became the hegemonic power in the 19th century, as it was the first state to industrialize. By 1860, Britain accounted for about 37% of the European industrial production, 20% of world industrial production, and 80% of newer technology industries. Britain effectively shifted from mercantilist policies to free trade policy. It removed most of its industrial trade restrictions by the 1830s, and in 1846, it repealed its corn laws, which had restricted agricultural imports. The decline of British hegemony and World War I is the third era. The growth of trade became slower in the late 19th century due to depressed economic conditions, especially industrial protection on the European continent and the decline of British hegemony. This decline was due to decrease in Britain's productivity relative to the United States and Germany, which made it less competitive in trade and less able to serve as a market for other industries' exports. Second learning objective is to identify and explain the underlying philosophies of different theories of international trade. Theories of international trade tend to explain the nature and movement of international trade. Such theories can be classified into classical country-based theories, and these include mercantilism, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, Heckscher-Ohlin or HO theory. So let's unpack this. Theory of mercantilism. This trade theory prevailed between 16th to 19th century, where the wealth of a nation is measured based on its accumulated wealth in terms of gold and silver. It calls on nations to accumulate wealth by encouraging exports and encouraging imports, by encouraging exports and discouraging imports, as we covered. Theory of mercantilism aims to create trade surplus, which in turn accumulates a nation's wealth. Absolute advantage theory. Origin is in Adam Smith's An Inquiry into the Nature and Cause of Wealth of Nations, which was printed in 1776. And the theory is as follows. When one country can produce a unit of good with less cost, i.e. cheaper and or faster than another country, the first country has an absolute cost advantage in producing that good. The second theory is comparative advantage rather than absolute advantage, and this has its origin in David Ricardo's The Principle of Political Economy and Taxation, which was printed in 1817. As such, in this theory, nations can still gain from trade even without an absolute advantage. A country has a comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good in terms of other goods is lower in that country compared to other countries. Comparative advantage focuses on the relative productive differences, whereas absolute advantage looks at the absolute productivity. Next is the endowment theory or the Heckscher-Ohlin model or factor proportions theory. According to this theory, a nation will export the commodity whose production requires intensive use of the nation's relatively abundant and cheap factors, and import the commodities whose production require intensive use of the nation's scarce and/or expensive factors. Thus, a country with an abundant, cheap labor, as an example, would export labor-intensive products and import capital-intensive goods, and vice versa. On the other hand, modern firm-based theories include country similarity, product life cycle, global strategic rivalry, and Porter's national competitive advantage. Again, let's unpack these. Product life cycle theory. Due to a variety of factors, international markets tend to follow a cyclical pattern, which explains the shifting of markets as well as the location of production. Of note, the level of innovation and technology, resource, size of market, and competitive structure in combination influence trade patterns. In addition, the gap in technology and the preference of customers in international markets also determine the stage of international product life cycle. The next is the theory of competitive advantage in international trade. As propounded by Michael Porter in The Competitive Advantage of Nations, the theory of competitive advantage concentrates on a firm's home country environment as the main source of competencies and innovations. This model is often referred to as the diamond model, wherein four determinants interact with each other, and these determinants include 1. Factor conditions, 2. Demand conditions, 3. Related and supporting industries, which is vertical and horizontal integration, and 4. Firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. The third learning objective is to identify the trend of development in international economic relations up to World War II and beyond. During the interwar period, the United States emerged from World War I. Interwar period, of course, is the period between World War I and World War II. During the interwar period, the United States emerged as from World War I as the world's largest industrial power and the only major net creditor. Although the United States lent about $10 billion to cash-short countries during the 1920s, some of America's policies did not facilitate a return to an open, liberal economy. Let me also note that the ensuing U.S. government policies during the 1920s are not dissimilar to today's agreement on reciprocal trade and the tariffs that have come with. And the concern by many economists is that today's policies will lead to similar economic challenges that emanated from 1920s policies. For example, the United States initially insisted that its close allies, Britain and France, repay all their war debts. However, it also imposed import barriers that made it difficult for European countries, especially Britain and France, to gain revenue from exports so that it could service its debt obligations to the United States. The 1922 Ordney-Macomb Act raised U.S. duties. And when the US economy moved into depression after the 1929 stock market crash, the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act increased US tariffs to their highest levels in the 20th century. European states retaliated with their own restrictions, and consequently, world trade declined from 35 billion in 1929 to 12 billion in 1933. Now, what I just described, the counter tariffs by European states and the United States, it's essentially what the major concern is among many economists. For instance, there is an uptick in pricing that suggests an inflationary pressure from tariffs. The recent job reports suggest that there were just shy of a billion or a million less jobs generated than at this same period last year. So the concern is that tariffs and counter tariffs, which again, thankfully, most of the counter tariffs has only been restricted to US and China, and the Europeans have largely stayed, for the most part, of reciprocal tariffs. And the Canadians are working really hard to try to reach a trade agreement with the United States. But the concern is that just as happened when the European states retaliated with their own import tariffs, and consequently world trade declined from 35 billion in 1929 to 12 billion in 1933. On the other hand, hegemonic stability theorists argue that the lack of a global hegemon prevented the development of an open and stable international economy during the interwar period. Recognize that during the interwar period, yes, the United States was clearly an emerging power, but it did not really become the hegemonic power until after World War II. That's when it was clear that the United States led the NATO allied countries and allies and association of democracies, of course, juxtaposed against the communist countries of Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc of Europe, mostly Eastern Bloc of Europe. Let us now cover the institutional framework before World War II, right? Most international organizations, or IOs, formed between 1815 and 1914 were designed to utilize technological innovations, promote economic regulation and commerce, mainly among European states. The first financial IO, the Bank for International Settlement, BIS, was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to oversee the settlement of German reparations after World War I. But its main purpose was to promote cooperation among central banks. Other than the BIS, economic IOs during the interwar period were mainly concerned with developing international standards for facilities, equipment, and installations required for the functioning of the global trade. These organizations were not able to deal with major economic problems such as the Great Depression. The fourth learning objective for this week is to be able to explain the differences in the functions and rules of post-World War II institutions developed to manage international trade. In July 1944, as an example, delegates from 44 countries convened the Bretton Woods Conference, which was, of course, held in Bretton Woods, New England. And within 22 days, they endorsed a framework for a post-World War II international economic cooperation. Two international economic organizations resulted from the Bretton Woods Conference. First is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. The IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national governments and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. The stated mission of the IMF is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, and facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth while reducing poverty around the world. The IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. It now plays a central role also in the management of balance of payments difficulties and international financial crisis. Through a quota system, countries contribute to funds to a pool from which countries can borrow if they experience balance of payments problems. The second institution, post-World War II institution, is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which has now evolved to become one of the constituent banks within the World Bank Group. The World Bank Group, colloquially referred to as the World Bank, is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to government and private institutions of low and middle income countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects. The World Bank's vision is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. The World Bank is a unique global partnership of 5 institutions working for sustainable solutions that reduce poverty and build shared prosperity in developing countries. These 5 institutions include IBRD, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IDA, or the International Development Association, IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and the fourth is MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. The fifth is ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Note that each of these 5 institutions has a different mandate. Mandate 1, partnering with governments. Both the IBRD and IDA form the World Bank Group's institutions that provide financing and policy advice and technical assistance to governments of developing countries. IDA focuses on the world's poorest countries, while IBRD assists middle income and credit-worthy poorer countries. Mandate 2, partnering with the private sector. IFC, MIGA, and ICSID focus on strengthening the private sector in developing countries. Through these institutions, the World Bank Group provides financing, technical assistance, political risk insurance, and settlement of disputes to private enterprises, including financial institutions. Now, onto a different institution. In 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, became the main global trade organization. GATT was set up to eliminate protectionism, get countries trading freely among themselves, and help restore economic prosperity following the devastation of World War II. Accordingly, GATT was created to form rules to end or restrict the mostly costly and undesirable features of the pre-war protectionist period, namely quantitative trade barriers, such as trade controls and quotas. GATT also provided a system to arbitrate commercial disputes among nations, and the framework enabled a number of multilateral negotiations for reduction of tariff barriers. In 1995, the GATT was superseded by the World Trade Organization, or WTO. GATT, though largely successful in its goal, lacked a coherent institutional structure. In short, GATT was a legal agreement acting as an international organization. The World Trade Organization, on the other hand, incorporates the principles of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and is better positioned to carry them out because, among other things, it is better versed in issues such as intellectual property, has a faster dispute settlement mechanism, although that's been called into question currently, and wields more power. Again, that is also questionable given the current challenges in the international trading system and the WTO's complete inability to serve as a moderating or mediating force. But be that as it may, this is what the WTA was fashioned to do, especially WTO rules are applicable to services and aspects of intellectual property along with trading goods. Of course, GATT did not cover services, nor did it cover trade in intellectual property. The next post-World War II institution is the United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations and was established after World War II. And this charter was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, and it took effect on 24th October 1945. So you can see that from Bretton Woods to San Francisco, the United States was really the convener and the major architect of the current international order that includes and that traces its continuum to the World Trade Organization, and which is why most economists, especially from Western countries and in particular the United States, are really ardent supporters of the international order that the Trump administration is said to be overturning. Anyhow, with the aim of preventing future world wars, the United Nations is an intergovernmental organization whose stated purpose are to maintain international peace and sovereignty, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, and serve as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It is the world's largest international organization. Now, as I mentioned, every class, there are going to be keywords and phrases that I'm going to ask you to please make a note of. To the extent possible, try to utilize them in your professional communications or even in your communications with your friends and associates. These have really signaling effect, and it suggests to the audience that you truly have a technical understanding of the subject matter. And one of these key phrases is balance of payment, or BOP, also known as the balance of international payments. It is a statement of all transactions made between entities in one country and the rest of the world over a defined period, such as a quarter or a year. The two main components of a balance of payments account are current account and capital account. First, current account. A country's current account records the value of exports and imports of both goods and services. The second, of course, is capital account. In this case, a country's capital account tracks the net balance of international investments. In other words, It keeps track of the flow of money between a nation and its foreign partners. Lastly, as we wind down this week's lecture, let me foreshadow next week's lecture by confirming that Module 4 will be on the major institutions for managing world trade. And with that, I am going to turn off the recording and then open up the class to Q&A.